Good evening. You're listening to the Xtreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob. Alongside me tonight, I have also from Central Florida, Professor Pixel, the young 20-something. I keep calling you the young millennial Pixel, but really you're Generation Y, or I don't know what the hell you're called. But the bottom line is you're a really young dude that hasn't seen a lot of this crap, and that's why you're on the Xtreme Movie Show reviewing a lot of movies, particularly weird ones and old ones, like tonight's 1983 gem of a troubled film by Michael Mann called The Keep. That, if you didn't know, Pixel, Michael Mann has done some great stuff. He did the original Man Eater, which is, of course, the serial killer Silence of the Lambs that people don't seem to know about. I think made for TV movie in 85, 86, of course, known for Miami Vice and other things as well. Directed Thief, which just came out a couple years earlier than this, a year or two earlier, starring James Caan. It's one of the best heist movies of all time, which we've yet to cover here on the Extreme Movie Show. But circling back to The Keep, the reason why the heist theme is important is because we get an interesting setup here with a very aggressive Tangerine Dream synthwave score of World War II times, where there's a small village and there's a keep in it. Great set pieces and fog machines let people know that you're in the 80s when it comes to films. It was filmed in Wales too, actually near where we talked about The Prisoner, believe it or not. So those of you that have listened to our Prisoner episode by episode review know exactly what we're talking about. This is a movie that does not get talked about a lot, and we get a demon getting released from this keep with Nazis trying to team up with Jews to get it back in. And so, without leaning too hard into the obvious butting of heads philosophically of what's going on here, I don't know whether I should call this a fantasy film, which is what I think it is, because I don't know if it's a horror film, but it's got a great vibe to it. It's very atmospheric. It's got a younger Ian McKellen and a Gabriel Byrne, who I always thought just had the great serial killer pox face. Looks fantastic. This is a gem worth watching, in my opinion. I enjoyed it and have not seen it in quite some time. Unfortunately, if you're going to see this film, don't see the 90-minute version. You've really got to see the almost like 3.5 hour version, whatever it is, the director's one, because it's so screwed up. And it's one of the first films that I've heard of as a child that when you don't have the director's cut, you're not seeing their vision of it. And unfortunately, that's the case with The Keep. But that being said, it's developed a cult following. It's considered very interesting for whatever the hell that means. But tell me what you think it means for you, sir, and what your like was viewing on this the first time.
Well, I had wished I had seen the 3.5 hour version. I saw sadly the 90-minute version on some streaming platform. I think it's called Criterion, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But The Keep, I didn't know exactly what to expect. I saw like bits of the trailer, and it's trailers that have gone out of fashion. The Keep heavily has one of those. But with that, I didn't know exactly what to expect. And so going in and seeing just how much of a turn that it takes and how good and evil are gone ahead and given corporeal forms to take on here, it definitely leans towards fantasy more than a horror film. Like, it has obviously the guy that's split in half. Yeah, that's pretty horrific. But the overall antagonist and protagonist, they're fighting to go ahead and fight this demon back into the keep it from getting out. But it's got such good bones. I want to see the full version, because even with the version that I got to see, I know that it's good.
It's hard to talk about this film without really diving deep into the obvious World War II and concentration camp aspect too, and the politics involved, especially if you're Jewish and or what your feelings are on it too. I will simply say that obviously in the 80s things were much more closer to what was going on for World War II with a lot of people around. So it was more of a sensitive topic than what it might be today. Certainly not to diminish anything that happens on there, but that's one of the themes to it, is that, you have the sadistic German guy who comes in, kills some of the civilians or like that. We already see that some of the soldiers had tried to steal these crosses that are in this keep without knowing what's going on. That's what releases this demon. And I'm just saying demon. Of course, you call it what you want, but it really is kind of like a play on wills between him and this other German guy too, about what's the best way to deal with this. So I guess the question, that some might go is well, Nazis can't do anything without the help of the Jews, or they'll realize, the error of their ways if they get the help of the Jews, generally speaking, because it turns out that they end up having to get this Jewish historian to kind of help them out, because there's like, this mystery messages written around and stuff. And it's kind of, it almost seems like an adult dark fantasy, Indiana Jones lightish kind of thing, not because it's, fun, because this movie's not. It's very dark, has a very
Yeah.
heavy tone to it. We see the Jewish historian guy. He's taken back from a concentration camp, and we get some religious stuff going in here too. But I, unfortunately, with seeing the chopped up version, you don't get to dive deep into some of these things, which I think, man, with how spectacular he does his films, we don't really get that full version of what to see in here. But that being said, the demon that you see in here, despite the effects being early 1980s, I think it looks pretty good in here for what they do. They don't overdo them or anything, but it's just one of those things too. So if you're
Oh,
watching, you might go, "Oh, the effects are horrible, therefore it's not realistic, so I don't like it, or I think it's bullshit." I don't. I think the score and I think the setup and the set pieces, like I say, and tons of fog machines and smoke machines, it really does kind of work too, because when we get to the end, we see what happens, but the getting there part, it has a good pacing to it. Like I say, it feels dark, and when you see those Nazi badges on armbands when they're rolling in with the tanks in a small little village, you're like, oh shit, what's going to happen here? And
yeah.
you could argue that they get their just desserts in a way too.
Yeah, it's also worth saying. What's his name? Molazar. I think that's the name of the evil, the great evil in the cape.
Hmm.
Um, he's definitely cool looking. I have some thoughts of his look and how they might actually have inspired something that nobody's
Yeah.
talking about.
Yep. I know
Um,
exactly what you're going to say, and I didn't even watch them. Go ahead.
yeah. Uh, but I actually want to go ahead and take a turn and talk about Ian McKellen,
Yes, Sir
who,
Even McKellen.
yes, sir, Ian McKellen. And at this time, he is not as old as he is now. What a surprise when you go back, watch something
He was
old.
only in his 40s, I think, around this time, around 40, 45.
It's incredible just how young he is. I've never seen him look younger,
Hmm.
ever. Um, but it's also funny because when they start out the movie, he's playing a pretty much an old man. He's like, "Oh, I'm bound to my chair. Ah, of course you'd feel that way." And then through Molazar, he is healed to become one of his, pardon me, one of his servants to help fight the Nazi threat. Uh, but it's yeah, no, I loved Ian McKellen in this movie. I think he did a great job playing an old man.
Well, he did, and he's obviously one of the, I hate to say it, but old school theater actors that was able to make the successful transition in the film. And if you didn't know him at the time, he might not. He wasn't the Ian McKellen that, like, say, him as at the time
No,
necessarily. And the same thing could be said for Gabriel Byrne being younger, and people are like, who? And if you see this guy and you've watched a lot of 80s films, some of the ones we've covered here on Extreme Movie Show, you would know he's been around for quite some time
that's
and he has
right.
a presence. And
He also has a major role in a fantastic a cultural movement through a movie called Mad Dog Time. And if you see him in that, you'll get to see one of the greatest performances of my way ever. Just ever. Trust me. It's worth it.
okay, glad you got your plug in. I totally forgotten about that one. Well, this also
I
has Scott Glenn in it too, who was just about to go nuclear in the 80s for what he's done, because he's been around for a long time as well. So I was just going to say the acting in here is good.
yeah, no, the acting is very solid. I think the story elements that we're following, even with the daughter,
Yeah.
Eva, who falls in love with Molazar's enemy. I don't remember his name. It's been a few weeks since I've seen it at this point.
Hmm.
Um, but with that, like there's this love scene between them, and you're watching, and you're not sure who to root for at that point. Like he's got this dark presence. You think, okay, there's something inside him. Obviously, he's a bad guy, but actually, it's Molazar who wants to kill the Nazis. He's the bad one, and that's an interesting turn. The guy that wants to kill the Nazis is bad, yes, but guess what? You can still have the Nazis dead, and everybody's happy.
That's true. The threat has been neutralized by the end of the movie, even if the Americans didn't do it.
That's right. That's right.
No, it's a lot of movies are obviously based off of books, just like this one was here too. But we've talked about here on Xtreme Movie Show how you had your B level, C level, D level, sword sorcery type fantasy elements that were really strong a little bit in the 70s and kind of fading out after the 80s, and we've definitely covered a few of them like Conan, Gore, and Barbarian Queen, and some others here. But this one, I think, is a cut above all those because it did not necessarily do well at the theaters, in part because it was chopped up so much that when you watch it, you can feel where there's gaps, where things aren't necessarily making sense. So you're kind of automatically jumping and piecing things together, which isn't bad. But when you go from 3 hours to 2 hours, and then the studio says, no, you need to make it 90 minutes. I mean, it's one thing if you know that up front and you design it that way, but then when you go to do what you're doing and all that, and with somebody like Michael Mann, who pretty much redefined the way a lot of movies are made, you could argue, with him and Cameron in the 80s, the movie's not as good as it could be. And maybe it's better this way, that it's more of a cult classic that people don't know about because it feels like one. And if it was that great of a film and it wasn't a cult classic, maybe people wouldn't spend as much time and effort considering some of the nuances to it, like when you actually watch it going, hey, this isn't that bad. But to me, I do like I say, it's a bit kind of dark and atmospheric. I do like the soundtrack. Tangerine Dreams, one of those synthy type bands from the 70s that have done other things too, that added a little bit of that, what I call 80s synth sound to it. Obviously, they're known for doing, I believe, the soundtrack for Risky Business. If that's what some people remember, especially when Cruise is boning on the subway. But for me, overall, I think this film's good. I think it's definitely worth to watch. It's better than some of the other sword and sandal things that we've covered. It's certainly not near top tier like Conan is, but then very few things are. But unfortunately, keep us one of those movies that when you dive deep in the 80s, you go, God, it looks like a Miami Vice episode. Well, it's Michael Mann. Michael Mann was known for basically taking movies and adding music to it and kind of making movies like a music video. And in the 80s, we've of course got the montage scenes straight out of the A-Team and everything else there too. And a lot of it, like I say, is this stylistic approach that Michael Mann is fantastic for, where even if you watch his rebooted Miami Vice from about 15 years ago with Jamie Foxx in it, you're like, I'm not the biggest Jamie Foxx fan in there, but I think he's really fine in here. I think he's good. But the movie just, you feel like you're there. And when you're watching any Miami Vice episode and you're outside, being from Florida myself and been to Miami several times, you feel like you're there. And that's one of the wonderful things about film is, to me, it's not so much what they say, it's the feeling that you're there. And in the keep, we feel that we're stuck there. We don't know what's going on. Unfortunately, we're choosing between, pun intended here, the lesser of three evils, if you want to think of it that way. The two Germans kind of button heads each other, and of course the demon. But just to observe it going on and feel like you're there watching it and feeling the threat come in, like with the villagers and the whole setup, it's done well. I can't argue with it. I think it's worth it.
It's also time to address the fact that the Duffer Brothers definitely watched this movie.
So, I mean, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Look, if you look at Molazar and you look at Vecna, which is the villain of season 4, they look almost exactly the same. The only difference is that Molazar has a skull for a face more than Vecna. But they look very similar. And then I think there's a bit in here where it's almost like vines just try to reach up and grab something. It's exact. Like that, along with obviously Stranger Things has had the synth wave going for a long time, but there are just some musical notes that just hit the same vibe that they're going for. So yeah, I think they definitely took inspiration from this movie.
Well, I'll just throw this out there too, because of our age difference. Anybody familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, despite the fact that they've introduced a lot of cultural diversity from the PC perspective into, I believe it's their current 5th edition rules that has a lot of old timers upset. You know that Vecna was actually a Dungeons and Dragons kind of thing, right?
Yes,
Okay,
I know,
because
I know
you
that,
threw
but
me
I'm
with that.
saying the look of him, he doesn't actually translate to that. Just
I
the
thought you were
look.
going to go with Thanos
What?
because of the shape of the head and all that.
No,
That's what
not
he
at
looked
all.
like to me. I
Not
mean,
at all.
not that I
Thanos.
spent 2 seconds watching Avengers, but from what I've seen.
Yeah, no. Thanos, I think, was created before this, but um, yeah, no, no.
Final thoughts?
Final thoughts. Solid film. Surprisingly solid film. My interest was piqued, but then it had my attention, and I want to see the full version now because I think the 90-minute version, while obviously you can feel that it's cut down, I liked it. I really did. I think that there's just great elements, great structure, and I want to see it in its full glory.
Yeah, and that's one we'll definitely be taking a look at here in the future on the Extreme Movie Show. The 3-hour Michael Mann director's cut version, which, to be honest with you, I haven't even researched if it exists or if it's floating around. Because right now, the 90-minute version is available at least on YouTube for free, if not some of the other channels if you're here stateside. But that being said, yeah, I agree with you. I think The Keep's worth watching. It's it's atmospheric and it feels like a fall winter kind of film. It doesn't feel like when you pop on in the spring or summer. It just adds the atmosphere to it. And I will tell you, just kind of as one last little note, you definitely had in the 70s and definitely with Rambo and some other films in the 80s a blunt examination of World War II, Vietnam War, and war films that dealt with issues such as PTSD, like in Rambo, or in this particular case, what is evil? And well, maybe the whole Nazi evil thing, communism, and basically its form is it that alien of a concept that throwing a demon in here, kind of is the physical embodiment of it. I mean, I haven't read the book, so I don't know how much they go after the book or not. I think probably not a lot. But the idea here is that it kind of works. And even in Stephen King's short stories like Apt Pupil that deals with, a teacher that actually was a concentration camp torturer, let's say, back in the 80s when people would read stuff like that, you didn't have a lot of that mainstream wise. So it definitely is a product of its time. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah, it'd be tough to make a movie like this today that has this kind of upsetting, dark feel to it. But there you go, ladies and gentlemen. The Keep 1983, Scott Glenn, Gabriel Byrne, Ian McKellen, and a few others too. Check it out. It's definitely worth watching. For Professor Pixel, I'm your host, Rob, here on the Extreme Move Show. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And as always, remember, stay extreme.
Keep staying extreme.
Yeah, keep staying extreme.